How many of you have given up your television? How many of you have cut the cord and are no longer watching television in the traditional way? Oh, about a dozen or so. How many of you are watching many programs on a device other than a TV set now? Quite a few, maybe half. One website has already declared television dead. In fact, they call what we do now, we watch FANG. Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Goodbye, NBC, CBS, all the other networks and your offshoots, you are finished. We've come a long way, folks, in just the past few years. Before television completely morphs into something else and our memories of it are quaint rather than curious, I thought it might be of great help to go back into time and recapture those moments or those developments which really made their mark on us. That's just so we don't forget what made us what we are today and what we may become in the years ahead. I would guess that most of us in this room grew up with TV, and we've taken for granted some of the momentous changes and landmarks that we're about to share. I remember working in the industry from 1957 to 2004, and that's a 47-year career. And I will talk as an insider, as a consumer, and as a historian. Before we get into the technology, I'm often asked my favorite memories of folks I had to deal with along the way. How many of you this spring watched on FX the series Feud, the story of Joan Crawford and Bette Davis? How many of you? Oh, a good number of you, at least a half of you. I knew the real Joan Crawford, and she was every bit the bizarre person that Jessica Lange portrayed. Now, one day back in the early 1970s, we were doing a series of films called Joan in January. It was January, and Joan Crawford was presenting the pictures in which she made her mark. Mildred Pierce, Possessed, all those great pictures. And I went to her apartment to pre-interview her. The doorman sent me up, and I went upstairs, and I knocked on the door opened, and there was the dumpiest little lady that I've ever seen. She was wearing a babushka, she was in an apron, she was carrying a mop, and I said, "I'm here to see Miss Crawford." She said, "I'm Miss Crawford." And she ushered me into an apartment where all of the furniture was covered in thick plastic. I'm not a psychologist, but I will tell you now that I realized that Joan Crawford had turned into her mother, who was a washerwoman. Before I get into the two main topics today, the technology and the content, I want to talk just a bit about my own career. In my very earliest years in television, almost 60 years ago, I had the distinct pleasure of working with Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt. That's FDR's widow. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt had a monthly television series done in Boston at WGBH, and we had wonderful guests on it, including President John F. Kennedy. Those were in the early days of public television in Boston. It had only existed in Boston for about a year at that time. So my career got a really nice boost early on. Now let's begin. Let's talk about technology. Experimentation on television began in the 1920s, not only in the United States, but in Britain. And the first commercial broadcasts in America were launched in 1939 at the opening of the New York World's Fair, 1939, Flushing Meadow Park, New York. And then it was put into mothballs for the duration of the war and didn't resume until after the war was over, about 1946 or 47. Now, what has always been, now this is a question for everybody in the audience, what has always been the engine behind the sales of television sets? Anybody? Advertising. Advertising, no. What has been the engine?
Milton Berle.
Milton Berle. Well, yeah, we'll get to him. But the real engine was sports, okay?
Lowest common denominator.
Sports was the reason why sets were sold, because it was the man who was the breadwinner, who had the money in the house and determined when the television set would be bought. So in 1947 or 48, that was a huge amount of money. $325 for a 10-inch set was enormous in those days. So sports did it. And that's Joe DiMaggio up there on the cover of TV Guide magazine. And television was indispensable without sports and without TV Guide. You didn't know what was on unless you had TV Guide. Now, in 1947, there were less than 100,000 television sets in the entire United States of America, and most of them were in New York because the World Series took place in New York that year. It was the New York Yankees versus the Brooklyn Dodgers. Who won? The Yankees, of course. Now, in those days, there were only two sizes of television sets, the 10-inch RCA set that you see, and the 12-inch humongously sized television set from Dumont that only the rich people down the block could afford. Now, these days you see television advertising in the newspapers or magazines or whatever for these big giant plasma sets. Well, we have the same kind of thing except for 10 and 12-inch sets. Now, why did sports become the driver? As I said, it was the man who bought the television set. Now, advances in technology were always designed to go along with sports. So why were things like this invented? Instant replay. Okay, there's one thing. Slow-mo. Freeze frame. Zoom lenses, all the tricks and techniques that became standard instantly after being introduced. And it was done for sports. Now, the television we came to know in those days was an outgrowth of radio. Local and network radio was an industry that had mushroomed during the 30s, during the Great Depression, when people didn't have as much as a dime to pay for outside entertainment outside the home. Commercial advertising paid for the entertainment. So the bulk of it was a mix of vaudeville acts and dance bands and local performers, and it was free. So the business model for early television followed the hugely successful methodology that radio used. By 1948, two programs ignited a mad rush for TV sets. Now, who's the man who said Milton Berle back there? Okay, so the first one was, both of them were in June of 1948. That's when it all happened. And the Texaco Star Theater went on a Tuesday night at 8 o'clock. And an immediate success, with Milton Berle, a has-been vaudevillian, becoming the most famous person in America, becoming known as Mr. Television. In fact, a couple of years later, NBC signed him up to a 30-year contract for $200,000 a year. Can you imagine that? And that was just a few months after an extraordinary success. And he had been just a moderately successful vaudevillian who was beloved for his imitation of Carmen Miranda, the Brazilian bombshell. So drag was an early television novelty. And now, a few weeks after Berle came Ed Sullivan. So Ed Sullivan, here he's seen with the Beatles. He introduced the Beatles as well as Elvis Presley on American television. He's a stone-faced New York Daily News entertainment reporter who was one of the most unlikely candidates to be a huge star. Slapstick, grand opera, high culture, all the things mixed together every Sunday night, so it was a regular block party everywhere. By the end of the 40s, that's only 1950 or so, there were 1 million sets in use. And the TV stations started opening in every market, major and minor. And viewers learned to tune each channel every time that they changed stations. Now, who are these two wonderful women on the roof moving the antenna? You all know Ethel Mertz and Lucy Arnaz, right? Lucy Ricardo, actually. Yes. Now, I knew both of these ladies throughout my years in television. I got the chance to work with both of them. Vivian Vance, who was also an ex-vaudevillian, happened to be a bit of a genius, and she hosted a show for me for 2 weeks on a trial basis, and she refused to come back because every time she went on the air, an emergency had happened. This is 1973 or 74, and we had our own problems in this country. And she said, I don't want to stay on this program, she said, because I'm sure I'm going to cause a stock market crash. And Lucy always wore her heart on her sleeve, and she would tell you anything. Why did she split up with Desi? Well, she said, I like to be the first at the party and the first to go home. He liked to be the last at the party and the last to go home. We could not possibly work together. Network television came into its own in the 50s. Now, the eastern and midwestern stations had been joined by something called coaxial cable, a big, thick cable. But we couldn't reach that cable, stretch it all the way to Los Angeles for a long time. So Chicago was the dead end of the network at that time. Well, sometime in the early 1950s, they strung up these microwave towers across the country. Now, microwave in that day had nothing to do with ovens in your kitchen. Okay, they were these huge towers that transmitted television signals. And in 1951 came the first coast-to-coast World Series telecast. Now, the 50s brought us really important developments. In the late summer of '58, I was working at one of the first educational, later to be called public, television stations in the country, WGBH in Boston. They're still on the air. You see their programs all the time on WXEL and WPBT. We took delivery of one of their first giant Ampex machines. You can see what this looks like there. It was a huge, that was, in the days before VHS and everything, this is what they needed to record a program. Several weeks went by, our engineers tinkered with it, installed it. It still hadn't been tested. And one Tuesday morning in October of 1958, I got a call from a press agent who was handling Flower Drum Song. Do you all remember Flower Drum Song? That was a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical that was testing in Boston. They used to do tryouts outside of New York City. And the show opened on a Monday night, and Tuesday night, I always had the stars or the director or whatever come to our show, the Elliott Norton Reviews program. Elliott was a great theater critic, and the press agent called and said, I can't deliver Rodgers and Hammerstein tonight. I'm sorry, I just can't do it. So I said, well, maybe we could videotape them this afternoon. He said, well, whatever that is, of course, we'll do it. So I called our engineer. I said, is the machine ready? Can we try it on the air tonight? We have Rodgers and Hammerstein. Could they come over this afternoon? Yes. And so they drove up in their limousine, and they came up to the studio, and we recorded a half-hour show with Rodgers and Hammerstein. There they are sitting there, and that's me with my head down there over Elliott Norton's shoulder. And we taped the show, and then I invited the entire staff of our station. And these are people who our staff was young and vibrant, learning television, and they got a chance to meet the legendary composers of Oklahoma and Carousel and South Pacific and later Sound of Music. Well, after they had their milk and cookies with Rodgers and Hammerstein, I invited Rodgers and Hammerstein to see the show. And Oscar Hammerstein said, well, don't you have to develop it? I said, no, come with me, and took them into the control room where this giant machine was. The engineer pressed the button, and on came the show. Half an hour, and it looked like a live television show. Richard Rodgers' jaw dropped at the end. He said, do you know that next time we do Cinderella, we never have to do it again? Now, that was only one gigantic technological leap for TV, and it was, for the record, the first use of on-the-air video in New England, I would say. Portable cameras, that's another breakthrough, not only for sports close-ups, but for political conventions where they were introduced in 1956. You know him, don't you? Everybody know him? Walter Cronkite. He loved sailing. And did you know that the reason why he called himself an anchorman was because he was a sailor, of course. I know it sounds peculiar, but people were really excited about seeing politicians up close on the convention floor. Now, how did the cameras become portable? Well, there's a man here who used to be a television technician. Where are you? Where's the fellow from Canada who came up to see me? He was a television repairman. In those days, all the tubes in the cameras and in the television sets were electric bulbs, basically. Well, in the late 1950s came transistors. And all of a sudden, not only did devices become lighter, but they gave off less heat and were liable to stay in good repair longer. Some other technological leaps that were just as important as videotape and portable cameras. And that is Space Command. Do you all know what Space Command was? Well, it allowed viewers to change channels without getting up from their seats. And it was connected by wire to the television set. Later, with an electric eye, they were able to make it possible so that you didn't have to connect it by wire. Now, almost everything has a remote control application. Everything we do. I was this is many years later, maybe 50 years later, I was at an awards ceremony of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, and they were honoring the two men at the Zenith Corporation who had invented Space Command. And one of them said very proudly, "I invented the couch potato." Now, of course, color was a major improvement, another marketing step to make older sets redundant. Then much later came big screens, flat screens, and the change in aspect ratio. You all understand aspect ratio. I don't have to tell you. Edison and the boys invented the 3x4 standard for movies back at the turn of the previous century, and television tried to catch up by emulating what was in the theaters with CinemaScope and widescreen, and so we now have widescreen television. Of course, all the sets we had were made redundant eventually. Now, with the challenge of the flat screen licked, we also had to invent home theater, which meant stereo and Dolby and another way of making our present sets obsolete. Another major development along with big screen home computers was what we've all begun to know as streaming. Do you all understand that? So that entire films, excerpts of films, home movies even, specially prepared materials can be shown on your television set anytime, even on your computer. So we see how manufacturing, marketing, development, obsolescence, and redundancy all contributed to our gross national product, our systems of distribution, and the carving up of an ever-enlarging pie of programming opportunities. Some technological changes haven't been as successful. Three-dimensional TV has not caught on. Who has a 3D set? Oh, we have about a half a dozen in the room. That's terrific. But it's rare to see those sets on display anymore. Programming never followed the technology, although there are hundreds of movies now in 3D that are available. And virtual reality. How many of you have tried virtual reality? About half. That's tremendous. No major results, but who can tell? And curved screens, who knows? No quick summary of television and its innovations would be complete without my next page. Without telecasts, there are two major events in 1968 and 69. One of them was the Christmas Eve Apollo 8 voyage around the moon. How many of you were able to witness that live telecast? Oh, goodly number, maybe 2/3 of you. With astronauts Lowell, Borman, and Anders reading from the book of Genesis. Religious people and atheists alike were teary-eyed that Christmas Eve. That was a fabulous moment. That was 1968 Christmas Eve. And then, of course, the next year was 1969. You all remember the date, July 19th and 20th. The massive technological achievement of television was only the frosting on the cake of man's greatest magnificent step forward. The worldwide telecast of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. Like no one who experienced it, I remember where I was. I was at a Club Med on the island of Mallorca in the Mediterranean, watching a fuzzy picture on a remote island on the only TV set we could find. That was 50 years ago. That memory won't fade. Now we move now from technology to content. At first, television was live. And it was one of the primary attractions, especially sports. I was growing up in Forest Hills, Queens. Do you remember the events that used to go on in Forest Hills? Yes. But before the U.S. Open, there were two tournaments. The professionals, they had 10 days, and the amateurs had another 10 days in the stadium at the West Side Tennis Club. And I lived across the street. So I haunted the West Side Tennis Club when I was a kid. And I saw television being produced. 2 cameras covered all of the action in those days, but it was shown as it happened, and it was true. Now here are some of the groundbreaking live events which changed the way we used and were affected by television. The first presidential debates. The famous debate in 1960 when Richard Nixon's refusal to wear makeup made him look far less appetizing than the very tan and rested Senator John F. Kennedy. JFK, by the way, was a man who listened to the pros. When I had worked with him first in January 1960, before the famous debate, he readily agreed to wear a TV blue shirt so his face tones would register as good as possible on television. I gave him one of the TV blue shirts that I had in supply. He gave me his shirt, J-press, 16.5 neck, 35 sleeve, with a monogram, JFK, on it, and I gave him one of my bland TV blue shirts. Where is that shirt today? I could have given it to the Smithsonian. I could have done anything with it. I could have sold it on eBay later, right? But I had it laundered and sent to him at the Senate office building in Washington, and I don't have that shirt to wear for you today. 2 other remarkable events changed the way we began to understand our country and the way in which the public could participate. For any of you who are students of law or government, crime, and we all are now, right? Come to think of it, that includes all of us when I realize what's been going on in our country. Here are 2 turning points, way back. The Kefauver hearings. Do you remember Estes Kefauver? Anybody old enough to remember? Well, the subject was organized crime, and for the first time, mafia figures appeared on television, like the notorious Frank Costello. Now, in 1950, remember, most Americans don't have a TV set, but they visited friends who did, or they went to appliance stores, or they even went to movie theaters to see these hearings on television. And the Army-McCarthy hearings came next. In the spring of '54, during weekend afternoons, the nation was riveted to TV and not soap operas. There was a weeks-long series of Senate hearings investigating conflicting accusations between the United States Army and U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy. That's Joe McCarthy up there. And he's sitting there with the notorious but brilliant lawyer, Roy Cohn. McCarthy was an aggressive anti-communist. Eventually, he was censured by the Senate, but for the time, these hearings presented a bizarre parade of witnesses with blackmail, cropped photographs, mishandled documents, taboo subjects like homosexuality. In the government, unbelievable. And you couldn't turn it off. And its high point, one of television's greatest moments, then or since, was the confrontation between the senator and, who is this man? Joe Welch. McCarthy had slung mud at someone during the proceedings. A simple declarative sentence from Attorney Welch turned the tide. He said, and you can probably say it along with me, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness." Then he said, "You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" Daytime soap operas could not compete with that. Yes, Joe Welch had an impact, but in no way do I wish to diminish the significance of Edward R. Murrow. Here he is, one of the greatest journalists who ever lived. He single-handedly pretty much covered the Blitz in London in 1940, live under the onslaught of the bombs. His great reputation began in World War II when he was head of the CBS London Bureau. And then, just after Welch's destruction of McCarthy, Murrow put McCarthy in his place and allowed the nation to sleep peacefully once more. Nightly network newscasts, which were filmed newsreels, then became 15-minute live shows, half-hour live shows, using the great resources of the three major networks. I've already mentioned Walter Cronkite, but does anybody here remember Huntley and Brinkley? Good night, Chet. Good night, David. They were outstanding journalists. One of them was based in New York, one of them in Washington. Now, educational, later public television emerged slowly in the late 50s. Houston and Boston and San Francisco were the early cities with non-commercial stations, several years ahead of New York, by the way. Your show of shows in 1950 changed the nature of live TV entertainment with a 90-minute variety show every Saturday night. Original comedy writing provided, believe it or not, by a teenage Woody Allen, Carl Reiner, that's Rob Reiner's father, Larry Gelbart. Larry, of course, is the creator of the television series MASH. What an incredible, pardon? Mel Brooks was part of it. Howard Morris, you know this group. Then came, we have to talk about other live events. I don't want to omit the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. In 1927, that series first began, but it didn't get on television until 1952. Now, in 51, Lucy and Desi, Lucille Ball and her husband, Desi Arnaz, revolutionized TV by taking the radio sitcom, putting it in front of three 35mm movie cameras, and doing it in front of a live studio audience. Now, in doing so, what they did was create a new way of syndication and distribution. It meant internationally, shows could be shown later. On the West Coast, they could be shown at any time, but 20 years from now, 30 years from now, they'd be shown on things yet to be created, like Nickelodeon. Then came the Olympics. The first Olympics to be televised were the Winter Olympics at Squaw Valley, California in February 1960. Just the beginning of this incredible television franchise. I remember those 2 weeks quite well because I was working in Boston. And Boston at that time only had two television stations, an NBC affiliate, a CBS affiliate, and they split ABC's programming, and they had no room for the Olympics. So they came to WGBH, and we volunteered to run the Olympics on television for free. It meant we had to remove the commercials. And what were the commercials for? It was for a car called the Renault Dauphine. Do you remember that car? Yeah. And I was the designated guy who sat in master control and cut all the commercials off live. Color came in 1961 with the power of the Walt Disney Company and RCA behind it. The weekly Disneyland series moved from ABC to NBC and forever was shown in color. And what made it, partly, another reason it made it very successful was because it was paired with the first TV Western in color, which was Bonanza. Worldwide syndication. Now, just a little anecdote about the spread of television. In 1967, I was visiting Cuenca, Ecuador, a remote, small Andean city, which many of you today still have probably never heard of. My brother was serving in the Peace Corps there. So I went to visit him, and I just happened to arrive the night of the dedication of the first television station in Cuenca. It was a wonderful night. The Archbishop of Cuenca came up at the beginning, and he made an announcement to their one little camera, and he said, "This is going to be a tremendous achievement for education and culture in this city. I declare this station ready." And then they put on the first three programs. And what were they? Te Amo Lucy, La Pica Piedra, and La Marina de Michael, just like in the United States. And then I found out, after doing some digging, that the same person who was selling them that programming was part of a company that I belonged to in New York, Metro Media. Have you heard now of, and we'll go into some terms that I thought would be instructive. One is least objectionable programming. Do you remember there was a guy named Marshall McLuhan? And what did he say? The medium is the message. I quote from researcher Paul Klein. Viewers watch a program, he said, when they find something that doesn't offend them, and they'll stay with it. That's how TV became instantly familiar, predictable, and monotonous in tone. And that's how we happened to find ourselves for decades watching spin-offs and copies and retreads and bland TV like Petticoat Junction, The Beverly Hillbillies, Andy Griffith, Green Acres, I Dream of Jeannie. You know all these programs. I don't want to offend you by mentioning them because many of them might be your favorites. I don't know. But they're all in eternal reruns somewhere. Comforting eyewash. TV became known as the idiot box. And JFK's Federal Communications Commissioner Newton Minow called it a vast wasteland. That was least objectionable programming. Next, another thing is hammocking. No, not the lazy man's way to watch TV, just the lazy programmer's way to schedule it. Ever wonder how a not-so-hot show gets sandwiched between two okay programs? Used to work when there were few television stations, and when you didn't have a remote controller. You'd watch everything. When I moved over to cable in the 1990s, a former boss of mine, who was an expert at hammocking, tried to suggest to me that I do that in cable. I said, forget it. They're gone in 1 minute now. Next, appointment television. By the 70s, thanks to creators like Norman Lear, Grant Tinker, Aaron Spelling, Rod Serling, just to name a few, we had an on-rusher shows that demanded that you be there. You didn't have a VHS machine to time shift. You had to be there to see the latest Twilight Zone, or All in the Family, or MASH, or Mary Tyler Moore, or Charlie's Angels. You had to have an appointment. And you need a TV guide or word of mouth, otherwise you're going to miss it all. Let's get on to fairness doctrine and equal time. Beginning in 1949, the Federal Communications Commission required stations and networks to present controversial sides of every issue, to be honest, equitable, and balanced. And that doctrine was discarded in 1987. So we had 38 years, is it, where we were really held to account. We had to be on our guard or fined. And until 1983, there was an equal time rule, which meant debates and political debates, for example, were very, very watched, very carefully watched, and we had to use a stopwatch in every show we did. I was producer of many public affairs shows in Boston, including the debates at Channel 5 in New York City, where we had Gabe Pressman, the late beloved Gabe Pressman was one of our debate moderators. There were many challenges. Finding spokespeople for both sides and digging up obscure candidates. I remember one night in 1969, when I was producing a weekly program with the mayor of New York. Do you remember John Lindsay? Well, he was a Republican liberal. He told me after one of his Sunday night shows, "I'm going to announce I'm a candidate for re-election on the next show." I said, "No, you're not, John." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, if you go on and say that, we have to give equal time to the Democrat, the Socialist, the Communist, the Labor Party, all of the independents. I can't do that." He said, "When was the last time this building was inspected by the fire department?" Well, he lost that skirmish, but he did win the election. Then there is Teleside. I think that goes back, we're back a bit. Then there's Teleside. One of my bosses in the 70s coined that word, Teleside. It's when a programmer goes off the rails, whether it's his fault or not. It happened to everyone in the business occasionally. Inadvertent Teleside came at you when you least expected it. Do you all remember the Heidi story? The little Swiss girl of children's fiction. And there was a movie about Heidi that was going on NBC at 7 o'clock on a Sunday night. It was November 17th, 1968. And the New York Jets and the Oakland Raiders were in a really hard-fought game. And at 7 o'clock, they still had a few minutes to go, and boom, the NBC network killed the football game and went to Heidi. 7 o'clock. When the dust settled on Monday morning, several executives had lost their jobs, of course, and the Heidi rule now ensures that nothing interferes with sports, ever. Remember what I told you earlier, how sports is the driver of the industry. Now, on a local level, I'm going to give you an example of Teleside. We had a new program director. It was December 1964, and he was assigned to produce a local half-hour special on the world premiere at the Criterion Theater of My Fair Lady, 7:30 on a weeknight. Entirely sponsored by, for very big bucks, by Colgate toothpaste. Grand climax, of course, was to be the arrival of Eliza Doolittle herself, portrayed by the world's greatest actress at that time, Audrey Hepburn, right. Of course, the new guy in town, the new producer, the new program director, unaccustomed to New York, didn't figure on Christmas shopping crowds and mobs in Times Square, and Audrey's limo pulled up in front of the Criterion Theater during the closing credits. And he's leaving poor Arthur Godfrey, the host, in an absolute cold sweat and high dudgeon. And when you get Arthur angry, forget it. Teleside. Final example of Teleside. The sad story of Jessica Savage, the Golden Girl, the first female news anchor. And she was a remarkable talent, an Ithaca College graduate, remarkable. And she had a breakdown on the air. I think it was fueled by alcohol and drugs, although I don't know if that was ever discovered. A few weeks later, she died in a tragic auto accident. The only remarkably positive thing that happened after her demise is that a made-for-TV movie for Lifetime telling her story was made thanks to it being a tribute from her former Ithaca College roommate, Judy Gerard, who was then the program chief at Lifetime. It was the highest rated single made-for-TV movie in history up to that time. Today there are new phrases that define TV. Binge watching, natural outgrowth of the sale of box sets of series. Then came the premieres of entire shows on providers like Netflix and Amazon. And a major development is time shifting. Betamax and VHS machines, which we showed you before. In 1975 came Betamax, 76 came Sony. Within 2 or 3 years, Betamax was on the way out. Time shifting changed everything. Once viewers could speed through commercials or determine what they watched at the time they chose, it was goodbye to your local program directors, they're gone now, and to commercials. Almost overnight, advertisers had to find new ways. Now, what shows made the biggest impact in the United States? Before we get into these, I just have to mention one thing, since this is MENSA, right? Yeah. You folks probably most enjoyed, at the beginning at least, the game shows on television. I mean, we had charades, which were the mild kind of things, then the Goodson Todman kind of things, which we all appreciated, like What's My Line, and I've Got a Secret and To Tell the Truth, and so on. And Password, and the people at Goodson Todman and Barry and Enright, they did fabulously for many years. But the biggest successes and longest running successes, of course, are the two shows that you watch every night now, aren't they? Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy. Right. Those are the two that still attract the same kind of viewer, and definitely within MENSA, I think. It's just like doing the daily crossword puzzle. You have to see those shows. Now to the shows and personalities that were creations of TV. We have up there Arthur Godfrey, who I mentioned before. Remember, everybody in television, then and now, is ephemeral. Here today, gone tomorrow. Nobody remembers Arthur Godfrey or ever talks about him. So, goodbye the Kardashians and even that guy who went from cheesy competition host into politics. They're all ephemeral. Now, Arthur Godfrey, lots of homespun, folksy humor, shrewd judge of talent, but a seething, unpredictable temper. Now, do you all remember who he fired on the air? Julius LaRosa, one of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. And he wasn't humble enough for Godfrey. In other words, Godfrey wasn't getting as much fan mail. Then there was Steve Allen, who was literally born in a trunk during his parents' vaudeville acts, and whose glib wit and great musical talent made late-night TV an institution. Howdy Doody, the first nationally distributed puppet show, when it was cheaper to have marionettes than people. And Ernie Kovacs, whose zany, surrealistic comedy in the 50s opened the way for Monty Python and some of the people on Saturday Night Live. Now, then there are here two icons of television that we've mentioned before. One is Bishop Fulton J. Sheen. He began his appearances on TV before World War II. He was in he led a church choir in 1939. Throughout the 50s and 60s, he presented a weekly show that appealed to everybody, including atheists. I produced his color series, by the way. Today, I'm hopeful that one day he will be sanctified. There's a movement afoot. And I introduced Dr. Ruth Westheimer to TV back in the 80s. A friend of mine was her doctoral advisor at Columbia University, and he introduced us, and the rest is history. She's fast approaching 90, and she's a Holocaust survivor who revolutionized the way in which we talk about sexual relations on TV and in public. A few of the longest lasting developments in programming. All in the Family, MASH, Seinfeld, The Golden Girls, which allowed sitcoms to be current and challenging, topical and upfront. They redefined all of comedy. The great police and hospital procedurals, CSI, Law and Order, St. Elsewhere, Hill Street Blues, which gave way to their descendants, The Sopranos, The Wire, Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul. TV drama changed everything forever, with one-hour shows that had 2 or 3 storylines going on with guest stars, and then 2 or 3 other storylines going on with the continuing characters. And then the great nighttime dramas, Dallas, The Fugitive, West Wing, and then the great British shows like Upstairs, Downstairs, and Downton Abbey. Sci-fi triggered by The Twilight Zone and Star Trek and Lost and X-Files. It was Rod Serling and Gene Roddenberry, by the way, the producers of those shows, who not only gave rise to so many other sci-fi shows, but who made it possible in the movies for us to conceive of 2001: A Space Odyssey and Avatar and Star Wars. Saturday Night Live, 35 years, stronger than ever, a not ready for primetime skit series with a roller coaster run, but currently riding the crest of a political wave. Ancestors of David Letterman and Jon Stewart and Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon and Stephen Colbert and Trevor Noah, everybody. Nighttime animation, not just for kids, the Flintstones, the Simpsons, and South Park, unbelievable successes. 60 Minutes, the mainstay from CBS, which spawned so many other news-oriented shows here and around the world. Everyone wants to be like 60 Minutes. Reality TV in its many formats, American Idol, The Amazing Race, Survivor, The Big Brother. Do you know why the Today Show was created? The man who brainstormed The Tonight Show was Sylvester Pat Weaver. He was NBC program chief, and he realized that when people turned off their sets at 1 in the morning after watching The Tonight Show, when they got up in the morning and turned on TV, the set would still be tuned to NBC. So he said, we have to have a show there so they don't change the channel. And he invented the Today Show. He was a visionary. You know what else he left us? Sigourney Weaver is his daughter. No wonder you can never underestimate her creativity or her intelligence. Now, out of this 70-year parade, we live today with a heavy diet of reality, in quotes, with competitions of strength, dancing, singing, and surviving. All of them from the once powerful, not struggling major networks. And binge watching of the most original, independently produced, uniquely distributed, and marketed series from what were the most unlikely programmers. Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Google, and Facebook. Who would have ever thunk it just a few years ago? Overnight, TV appeared on your phone and on your iPad, wherever you are, you found television in a new way. 10 years from now, what will happen? No one can answer that question. Who would have guessed that only a few years ago that Blue Apron would send us the ingredients for our dinners? That people would shop for clothing on a computer? That college courses could be taken at home? That teenagers would sit at home at their desks and not go out and socialize with their pals? Or that every bit of information one needed, or music that one wanted to hear, would be available from a faceless voice? Or that local television news shows would take on a political slant dictated by its owners? No, 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 no. What will television become? Here are some additional thoughts. The changes I've described in technology and in content, while revolutionary, are an outgrowth of scientific, cultural, and intellectual currents of our day. Mind that. There will be more and more politically managed decisions which will influence our TV. It's just the way things are going. The price of programming is going to go up very high because the businessman will be able to command it. And because the number of people who are working in this industry gets larger and larger, and people do need to eat, so prices are going to go way up. And certain events and issues may derail those things along the way, whether they're cases of violence during a reality show or some kind of sexual thing that goes beyond, over the line. There could be a retreat also, and we have to be wary of all of those things. Thank you for your patience.